In the USSR, there was a system of punitive psychiatry. People who criticized the authorities were declared insane and sent to mental hospitals. Officially, the authorities said they were helping these people, but in reality, they were breaking their fates. The first cases of such repressions appeared under Stalin. In the 30s, enemies of the regime were sent to camps or shot. But there were also those who were recognized as mentally ill. For example, if a person said that everything was bad in the USSR, it was considered abnormal thinking. Back then, such cases were isolated, but the method itself was remembered. Everything changed in the 60s when punitive psychiatry became a system. Under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, a new generation of people appeared in the country who were not afraid to speak the truth. Writers, scientists, workers. They opposed censorship and criticized the authorities. It was inconvenient to arrest them openly. It could cause a scandal abroad. Then another method appeared to declare them mentally ill. A special diagnosis was invented, sluggish schizophrenia. It meant that the person seemed to be not violent, but in his head are ripening dangerous ideas. This diagnosis was given to those who disagreed with the party line. In 1969, scientist Zhoris Medvedev wrote a book about the problems of Soviet genetics. The authorities could not just put him in jail because he was not a criminal. Then he was recognized as mentally ill and forcibly sent for treatment to a psychiatric hospital in Kaluga. No trial, no scandal. The newspapers didn't say that a dissident had been arrested, just that a sick man had been sent for treatment. People stopped believing the victim. After the asylum, a person could say anything. He was considered abnormal. It worked in an intimidating way. No one wanted to be among the abnormal, so many people shut up. Another example is Pyotr Grigorenko, a Soviet general who fought in World War II and received high honors. But in the 60s, he began to openly criticize the authorities. He was in favor of democracy and demanded the abolition of censorship. The authorities couldn't just lock up a war hero, it would look strange. Then the KGB found another way out, to declare him insane. In 1964, he was arrested and sent to a mental hospital where he was treated with potent drugs. He spent a total of 5 years in the asylum, although no doctor could prove that he was really sick. And in 1977, he was stripped of his Soviet citizenship while he was abroad so that he could not return. 10 years later, he passed away in New York. And already under Yeltsin, Pyotr Grigorievich was posthumously restored to the rank of Major General. In the 70s, in the USSR, there were at least 30 special mental hospitals where dissidents were sent. Some people were kept in the hospitals for decades, forced to take dangerous, mind-destroying drugs. One could end up in a Soviet mental hospital not only for politics. Sometimes a few careless words or even a lifestyle that seemed suspicious to the authorities were enough. The KGB's main targets were people who criticized the government. They were called dissidents. They could be scientists, writers, military men, journalists, any intelligent and active people who tried to change something. Sometimes the victims were even ordinary workers and employees who said the wrong thing to the wrong person. Often the reason for arrest was denunciation. A neighbor, a colleague, or even a relative could write a complaint. Sometimes people did it out of fear, sometimes out of envy or revenge. Even religious people could end up in a psychiatric hospital. The Soviet government considered religion harmful to society. Those who went to church or read the Bible could get diagnosed with religious delusions. People were tried to treat people for their faith with injections. They were given drugs that caused terrible hallucinations and complete exhaustion of the body. Many did lose their minds afterward. But psychiatry was not only used for politics. There were cases when a person was sent to an asylum to take possession of his apartment or to get rid of an inconvenient heir. If you had an apartment in the center of Moscow, there were always people willing to vacate it. In the USSR, there were no official statistics on how many people were victims of punitive psychiatry. According to various sources, the count was in the tens of thousands. Some patients were not even discharged after death. Their existence was erased from history. The man was recognized as sick, but what then? The newspapers said he was being treated, helped to return to normal life. The reality was different. These hospitals were more like prisons, and the treatment was torture. First of all, the will was broken. Newcomers were immediately registered and given drugs that made them lethargic, weak, unable to resist. The doses were enormous. Already in a few days, a person could not think clearly, and in a month, even normal movement. One of the worst drugs was insulin coma. The patient was injected with a huge dose of insulin, from which he fell into unconsciousness. This would last for hours, sometimes days. In fact, he was brought to the brink of death and then brought back to life. Patients said that after the insulin coma, they could not even remember their own name. Their head remained empty, and only after a few weeks they began to understand something again. Another method of sedation was to tie them to the bed. If the person protested, they were simply tied up for days or weeks. Without movement, the muscles weaken, the body aches, and the mind gradually breaks down. Some patients kept in this state began to go insane even without medication. But the most commonly used drug was haloperidol, a drug that turns people into vegetables. After taking it, people could not speak or move normally. They often had convulsions. Soviet writer Vladimir Bukovsky was treated with haloperidol. He said that after the injections, he could not control his body. His arms would rise, his legs would bend, and his head would twitch. At that time, anyone could become a victim. It didn't matter if you were healthy or not. If the doctors wrote a diagnosis, you were sick. No one could protect you. Relatives couldn't come and get you. There were no courts. You could never get out of the hospital. Some people were held for years, and some were not allowed out at all. Thousands of people died in mental hospitals, but the cause of death was always given as one thing: heart failure. The Soviet authorities denied for decades that psychiatry was used to kill dissenters. Officially, they said there were no political prisoners in the USSR, only sick people who needed help. But by the end of the 80s, it became impossible to hide the truth. Everything began to collapse during perestroika. In 1988, the authorities, for the first time, officially recognized that punitive psychiatry existed. It turned out that thousands of people were declared insane just because they criticized the system. Anatoly Korygin, a psychiatrist and Soviet dissident, spent several years in psychiatric hospitals for collecting evidence of repression. After perestroika, he was released and became one of the first to speak openly about atrocities in mental hospitals. For most people, release did not mean a return to normal life. Many came out of the hospitals shattered, physically and psychologically. Years on powerful drugs had taken their toll, and even after rehabilitation, they were still considered abnormal. Some former patients, despite being recognized as healthy, could not find work or return to their families. The stigma of being mentally ill remained for life. After 1991, some mental hospitals closed, but many are still operating today. Their past is carefully hidden, but the archives of these places keep terrible secrets. Doctors who made false diagnoses on the orders of the KGB were not punished. Conclusion: the Soviet power destroyed its enemies not only with the help of camps and shootings. Sometimes it was easier to declare a person insane. So he was forgotten, and the power remained clean. The stories of victims of punitive psychiatry are a terrible reminder of how a person's fate can be broken with just one diagnosis. What do you think about it? Write in the comments.